The London air was thick with fog and whispers on that dreary November morning in 1854. Sebastian Varington, the Duke of Thornfield, stood rigid before his late friend's grave, his gloved hands clasped behind his back as the vicar's monotonous voice droned on about the brevity of life. Rain fell in a steady, melancholy rhythm, but Sebastian barely noticed it soaking through his black overcoat. His mind was elsewhere, on James Nightingale's final, impossible request. "Your Grace," Lady Jasmine Nightingale whispered beside him, her voice barely audible above the patter of rain. "The carriage awaits." Sebastian turned to look at her, this woman who had been his friend's wife, now his widow. She stood completely still, her face partially obscured by a black veil, yet he could sense her struggling to maintain composure. 3 months of mourning had hollowed her cheeks and dulled the spark that once animated her green eyes. Yet there remained an undeniable dignity in her bearing, the quiet grace of a woman determined not to crumble beneath grief's weight. He offered his arm without speaking. Words seemed inadequate, and Sebastian had never been skilled with them anyway. He was a man of action, of duty, of honor, things that could be proven through deeds rather than sentiments. It was precisely this rigid adherence to duty that now trapped him in an impossible situation. The carriage journey back to Nightingale House was stifled by silence. Sebastian sat opposite Lady Jasmine, studying the passing London streets through rain-streaked windows. He had avoided being alone with her since James's death, but now there was no escaping the inevitable conversation that awaited them. "I presume Mr. Weatherby has informed you of the contents of James's will," Jasmine said finally, removing her gloves with measured deliberation. "He has." Sebastian's voice was tight. "Though I find myself questioning whether James was of sound mind when he drafted it." "You refer to the condition of our marriage." Her directness surprised him. James had always said his wife possessed an unsettling ability to confront uncomfortable truths, but Sebastian had rarely witnessed it himself. "It is an unconscionable request," he replied, "one that disregards both your feelings and mine. And yet entirely in character for James." Her laugh was hollow, always finding ways to control situations, even from beyond the grave. Sebastian studied her more carefully. "You do not seem surprised." "I have had 3 months to become accustomed to the idea, Your Grace." Her hands were folded primly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "Mr. Weatherby informed me shortly after James's passing." The carriage pulled to a stop before the imposing facade of Nightingale House. Sebastian helped Lady Jasmine descend, acutely aware of the whispers and glances from neighbouring houses. News travelled quickly in London society, and already speculation about the widow's future had begun. Inside, the house felt oppressive with grief. Dark drapes covered the windows, and servants moved like ghosts through dimly lit corridors. Sebastian removed his hat, following Lady Jasmine to the study where Mr. Weatherby, James's solicitor, awaited them with the necessary papers. "Your Grace, Lady Nightingale." The elderly man rose from behind the desk. "I trust the service was appropriate." "As appropriate as any burial can be," Sebastian answered curtly. "Now, shall we address the matter at hand? I wish to understand precisely what my friend was thinking when he crafted this preposterous arrangement." "Mr. Weatherby adjusted his spectacles. "Lord Nightingale's will is quite clear, Your Grace. The entirety of his estate, including Nightingale House and the country property in Hampshire, remains entailed to the Nightingale name. With no male heir, the properties would normally pass to his cousin, Mr. Edmund Nightingale. And I am well aware that Edmund is a dissolute gambler who would ruin the estate within a year," Sebastian interjected. "Precisely. To prevent this, Lord Nightingale created a condition. If you, the Duke of Thornfield, marry Lady Jasmine within 6 months of his death, the entailment will be broken. The properties will pass to Lady Jasmine for her lifetime, and subsequently to any children of this union." Sebastian paced the length of the study. "And if we refuse this arrangement?" "Everything goes to Edmund, and Lady Jasmine receives only her modest widow's portion, insufficient to maintain her position in society. She would effectively be destitute, Your Grace." Sebastian glanced at Jasmine, who stood by the window, her profile outlined against the grey London sky. "This is blackmail," he said quietly. "This is James," she replied, turning to face them. "He always believed he knew what was best for everyone. And did he consider that perhaps neither of us wishes to marry? That we might have our own desires, our own futures planned?" "I doubt it crossed his mind," Jasmine said with surprising candor. "James saw you as a brother, Your Grace. In his mind, he was simply keeping his fortune and his wife within the family." Sebastian felt a surge of anger toward his deceased friend. James Nightingale had been brilliant, charismatic, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness, a dangerous combination. Even now, he was manipulating them from beyond the grave. "I need time to consider this," Sebastian said finally. Mr. Weatherby nodded. "Of course, Your Grace, but I must remind you that the 6-month period began at Lord Nightingale's death. 3 months have already elapsed." After the solicitor's departure, Sebastian found himself alone with Jasmine in the study. Rain continued to lash against the windows, mirroring the turbulence in his thoughts. "What are your feelings on this matter, Lady Nightingale?" he asked at last. "My feelings?" She seemed startled by the question. "I don't believe anyone has asked me that since James died." "I'm asking now." She moved to pour herself a small glass of sherry. "I find myself with limited options, Your Grace. I could refuse this arrangement on principle, thereby consigning myself to poverty, or I could accept a marriage to a man who clearly resents the very idea of it." She took a measured sip. "Neither prospect is particularly appealing." "We barely know each other," Sebastian observed. "True, you were James's friend, not mine. I believe we've spoken perhaps a dozen times in the 5 years of my marriage." The frank assessment strung, though Sebastian couldn't deny its accuracy. He had always maintained a careful distance from his friend's wife, not out of dislike, but from a deeply ingrained sense of propriety. Beautiful women made him uncomfortable, beautiful, intelligent women even more so. "I have no wish to trap you in an unwanted marriage," Jasmine continued, "but neither can I pretend that the prospect of destitution doesn't frighten me. James left me ill-prepared for a life without his protection." Sebastian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I will not make a decision today. There is time yet, and such a choice deserves careful consideration." "Of course." Her tone was perfectly composed, but Sebastian detected a hint of relief. Perhaps she had feared he would demand an immediate answer. "I shall call again next week," he said, retrieving his hat. "In the meantime, if you require anything—" "I am quite capable of managing my household affairs, Your Grace." There was a flash of something in her eyes, pride, perhaps, or defiance. "I was not entirely. The Ornamental Wife Society believed me to be." Sebastian inclined his head, oddly intrigued by this glimpse of steel beneath her grief. "Until next week, then, Lady Nightingale." The week that followed was torturous for Sebastian. He went through the motions of his daily life, attending Parliament, managing his estate's affairs, fulfilling his social obligations. But his mind continually returned to James's final request. Marriage had never featured prominently in his plans. At 35, he had grown comfortable with his solitary existence, finding fulfillment in his political work and the management of his extensive properties. But he could not dismiss the promise he had made to James years ago when they were young men at Oxford. "I swear to look after whatever you hold dear, should anything happen to you." At the time, it had seemed an abstract pledge, the kind of dramatic oath young men make with no expectation of fulfillment. Now it hung around his neck like a leaden weight. Worse still were the whispers that had begun to circulate through London society. Somehow, rumours of James's unusual will had escaped the confines of Nightingale House. At Lady Pembroke's musical evening, Sebastian overheard 2 dowagers speculating on whether he would do the honourable thing or leave the poor Nightingale widow to fend for herself. "They say she brought nothing to the marriage but her beauty," one whispered behind her fan. "No fortune, no connections, nothing but a pretty face that caught James Nightingale's eye." "And now she may catch a duke," replied the other. "Some women have all the luck, deserved or not." Sebastian had abruptly left the gathering, his mood darkened by their callous speculation. The following morning, he found himself directing his carriage to Nightingale House a full 4 days before his promised return. The butler admitted him with obvious surprise. "Lady Nightingale is in the conservatory, Your Grace." Shall I announce you?" "No need," Sebastian replied, already familiar with the layout of his friend's home. "I'll find my own way." The conservatory was a riot of greenery and blooms, a stark contrast to the sombre atmosphere that pervaded the rest of the house. Sebastian paused at the entrance, taken aback by the sight that greeted him. Jasmine stood among the plants, her black morning gown discarded in favor of a simple grey dress with rolled sleeves. Her hair, usually confined in an elegant coiffure, was pulled back in a practical knot as she pruned an overgrown rosebush. She looked up at his footsteps, clearly startled. "Your Grace, I wasn't expecting you until Saturday. Forgive the intrusion. I found I could not wait to continue our discussion." He hesitated, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation. "Perhaps I should return when you are more formally attired." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "This is my gardening dress. The conservatory was James's pride, but it has been neglected these past months. I couldn't bear to see it wither." Sebastian moved closer, surveying the carefully tended plants. "I did not realize you shared his passion for horticulture." "There is much about me you do not know, Your Grace." She set down her pruning shears. "Just as there is much about you I remain ignorant of, which makes this proposed arrangement all the more absurd, does it not?" "It does." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And yet I find myself unable to dismiss it entirely." Jasmine studied him with those unsettling green eyes. "May I be blunt, Your Grace? I would expect nothing less. You are considering this marriage out of obligation to James, a final fulfillment of your friendship. But what of your own happiness? Surely you had envisioned a different future for yourself, perhaps with a woman of your own choosing." Sebastian turned away, ostensibly to examine a rare orchid. "I have never been particularly concerned with my own happiness, Lady Nightingale. My life has been guided by duty to my title, to my estates, to my position in society." "A cold comfort in a marriage bed," she observed, then immediately looked mortified at her own candor. The statement hung between them, charged with implications neither was prepared to address. Sebastian cleared his throat. "Perhaps we might approach this differently. I propose a compromise." "I'm listening." "We shall announce our engagement, as James wished. This will secure your position and quiet the gossips. During our engagement period, we will attempt to become better acquainted. If after 2 months either of us finds the prospect of marriage utterly intolerable, we shall break the engagement. I will provide you with a settlement sufficient to live comfortably, regardless of society's censure." Jasmine considered this, "And if we proceed with the marriage, then it will be with clearer understanding of what, and whom, we are committing to." "A reasonable proposal," she conceded. "But may I suggest one amendment?" "Of course. If we are to truly know one another, we must dispense with some formalities. In private, at least, I would prefer you call me Jasmine rather than Lady Nightingale. And I should like to call you Sebastian, if that is not too presumptuous." The request was modest, yet Sebastian found himself strangely moved by it, not presumptuous at all. Jasmine. Her name felt foreign on his tongue, intimate in a way that both unsettled and intrigued him. For the first time since James's death, Sebastian felt a flicker of something beyond duty and obligation. It was not hope precisely, but perhaps the possibility of it. The announcement of their engagement, a week later, sent shockwaves through London society. Some praised the Duke of Thornfield's nobility in protecting his friend's widow. Others speculated more salaciously about when their attachment had begun and whether James Nightingale had been aware of it. The more perceptive observers noted the careful formality between the engaged couple and wondered what truly lay beneath this unexpected union. For Sebastian, the weeks that followed were a revelation. True to their agreement, he and Jasmine dedicated themselves to discovering each other beyond the shadows of grief and obligation. They took daily walks in Hyde Park, where Sebastian learned of Jasmine's childhood in Cumberland, raised by a scholarly father who had educated her far beyond what was typical for young ladies. He believed women's minds were equally capable of profound thought, she explained as they strolled beneath autumn-tinged trees. He taught me mathematics, philosophy, Latin, all subjects deemed unsuitable for feminine sensibilities. And did you enjoy these studies? Sebastian asked, genuinely curious. Mathematics bored me terribly, she admitted with a laugh, but philosophy became a passion. There is something compelling about questioning the nature of existence, don't you think? Sebastian, who had never questioned anything about his predetermined path in life, found himself intrigued by her perspective. I confess I've always found philosophy rather abstract. I prefer the concreteness of political economy and agricultural improvement. Practical matters for a practical man, she observed. James always said you were the most sensible person he knew, steady as bedrock and twice as immovable. Not the most flattering comparison, Sebastian noted dryly, but accurate, I think. Her eyes crinkled with amusement. Though perhaps there is more beneath the bedrock than James recognized. These conversations continued through their visits to museums, art galleries, and eventually to Thornfield Abbey, Sebastian's ancestral home in Derbyshire. It was there, away from London's prying eyes, that their relationship began to shift in ways neither had anticipated. The abbey was a magnificent structure, parts dating back to the 12th century, with additions from every era since. Sebastian watched Jasmine's face as she took in the great hall with its hammerbeam roof and centuries-old tapestries. It's breathtaking, she whispered, turning slowly to absorb the grandeur, like stepping into history itself. My father used to say we are merely temporary custodians, Sebastian replied. The abbey has outlived generations of Varingtons and will continue long after we are gone. A humbling thought. She moved toward a family portrait that dominated one wall. Is this your mother? You have her eyes. Sebastian nodded, studying the painting of the elegant woman who had died when he was just 12. She loved this place more than anyone. She knew the story behind every stone, every portrait, every piece of furniture. And she passed that love to you. Yes, he hesitated, then added, this would be your home too if we proceed with the marriage. Jasmine turned to face him, her expression serious. And would I be welcome here, Sebastian? Truly welcome, not merely tolerated as an obligation fulfilled. The question pierced through his carefully maintained reserve. In the 6 weeks of their engagement, Sebastian had found himself increasingly drawn to Jasmine, to her intelligence, her resilience, the quiet dignity with which she carried her grief. Yet he had kept a part of himself guarded, unwilling to fully acknowledge the growing attachment. You would be more than welcome, he said finally. I find that I enjoy your company, Jasmine. Far more than I expected to. It was a modest admission, but from a man as reticent as Sebastian, it carried significant weight. Jasmine seemed to understand this, for her expression softened. As I enjoy yours, she replied. Though I never thought I would say such a thing about the stern, unapproachable Duke of Thornfield. Stern and unapproachable, he raised an eyebrow. Is that how you saw me? How everyone sees you, she corrected. The perfect embodiment of aristocratic reserve, always correct, always proper, always distant. And now? She stepped closer, close enough that he could detect the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her. Now I see glimpses of the man beneath the title, a man with passions and principles and unexpected kindnesses. A man James trusted above all others, and with good reason, I think. The mention of James cast a shadow between them. Sebastian stepped back, reminded of the ghost that hovered at the edges of their growing intimacy. We should join the others for dinner, he said, his tone suddenly formal. My aunt is most eager to become better acquainted with you. Throughout dinner, Sebastian was uncharacteristically distracted. Lady Agnes, his father's sister who had served as the abbey's hostess since his mother's death, carried much of the conversation, drawing Jasmine out with questions about her family and interests. Sebastian observed the easy rapport developing between the two women with a mixture of pleasure and unease. She's quite remarkable, your Jasmine, Lady Agnes commented later that evening when they were alone in the library. Not at all what I expected from the descriptions I'd heard. What had you heard? Sebastian asked, suddenly alert. Oh, the usual society nonsense, that she was a beautiful nobody who ensnared James Nightingale with her pretty face. that she's now worked her charms on you. Lady Agnes waved a dismissive hand. Jealous gossip from women who had hoped to secure either gentlemen for themselves or their daughters. Jasmine is far more than her beauty, Sebastian said, more forcefully than he intended. Indeed, his aunt studied him with shrewd eyes. She has a fine mind and genuine warmth. I believe she would make an excellent mistress for Thornfield Abbey and an excellent wife for its master if he would allow himself to recognize it. Our engagement was arranged for practical reasons, Sebastian reminded her, uncomfortable with her perception. Perhaps initially, but I have eyes, dear nephew. I see how you look at her when you think no one notices. Lady Agnes rose, patting his arm affectionately. James Nightingale may have orchestrated this match for his own purposes, but I suspect he understood something about both of you that neither of you yet recognizes in yourselves. She left him alone with these unsettling observations, which continued to trouble him as he retired for the night. His bedchamber overlooked the Abbey's east gardens, and as he stood at the window, he caught sight of a figure walking among the moonlit paths. Jasmine, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn chill, her face tilted toward the star-filled sky. Without conscious decision, Sebastian found himself pulling on a dressing gown and making his way down to the gardens. He told himself he merely wished to ensure her safety, but the quickening of his pulse suggested other motivations. "You should not be out alone at this hour," he said as he approached. She turned, unsurprised by his appearance. The house felt confined. I needed air and space to think. "About our arrangement?" "Yes," she drew her shawl tighter. "Our 2 months are nearly elapsed, Sebastian. Soon we must decide whether to proceed with this marriage or end the engagement." "And your thoughts on the matter?" he asked, heart inexplicably racing. "I find myself conflicted." She looked away, toward the dark silhouette of ancient trees against the night sky. "When James first died, I thought I would never feel anything again. That grief had hollowed me entirely. These past weeks have proven otherwise." "How so?" "I've discovered I can still feel interest, engagement with the world, even moments of joy." She paused. "And other emotions I had not anticipated." Sebastian stepped closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice. "What emotions?" "Confusion, guilt." She finally met his gaze. "Attraction." The admission hung between them, as tangible as the mist rising from the gardens. Sebastian felt a corresponding surge of desire, tempered by his own conflicted loyalty. "James was my oldest friend," he said quietly. "And my husband," she acknowledged. "His memory deserves our respect." "But Sebastian, he has been gone nearly 5 months now. Are we to live the rest of our lives in his shadow?" "I do not know," he admitted. "I only know that when this arrangement began, I viewed it solely as an obligation to be fulfilled. Now I find myself contemplating it as something else entirely, something that both exhilarates and terrifies me." Jasmine reached for his hand, her touch warm despite the cool night air. "I have never known the formidable Duke of Thornfield to admit to fear." "There is much about me you are only beginning to discover," he replied, echoing her earlier words. Their eyes held, a current of understanding passing between them. Then, with gentle deliberation, Sebastian raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that transcended mere courtesy. "We should return to the house," he said, though everything within him resisted the suggestion. "Separately, to avoid any appearance of impropriety." "Always the proper Duke," she murmured, but her smile held no criticism. "I shall go first. Good night, Sebastian." He watched her disappear into the shadows, his thoughts in greater turmoil than before. Something fundamental had shifted between them, something that could not be ignored or denied. The question was whether they had the courage to acknowledge it fully, and what doing so would mean for the memory of the man who had brought them together. The following afternoon found them riding across the estate, Jasmine surprisingly adept in the saddle despite her city upbringing. "My father believed physical exercise essential for a sound mind," she explained as they cantered across an open meadow. "He insisted I learn to ride, swim, and even shoot, all scandalously unfeminine pursuits." "Your father sounds like a remarkable man," Sebastian observed, admiring her confidence as she guided her mount over a low stone wall. "He was, eccentric and often difficult, but remarkable nonetheless." Her expression grew wistful. He would have liked you, I think. He valued integrity above all other qualities. And do you believe I possess this quality? In abundance, she slowed her horse, turning to face him. It is both your greatest strength and perhaps your greatest limitation. How so? Your sense of honor is so rigid, it leaves little room for the messier aspects of human emotion. She hesitated. Like what happened between us last night. Sebastian felt his cheeks warm despite the cool autumn air. I have been thinking about that. As have I, she admitted, and I've reached a conclusion about our arrangement. His heart constricted. Which is, I believe we should proceed with the marriage. The statement caught him completely off guard. You do? Yes, she straightened in her saddle, meeting his gaze directly. The practical reasons remain valid. I avoid destitution, you fulfill your promise to James. But there is more between us now, Sebastian, something worth exploring if you are willing. Sebastian was silent for a long moment, processing her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was uncharacteristically hesitant. I fear I would be a disappointing husband, Jasmine. I have spent my life devoted to duty rather than emotion. I am not naturally demonstrative. I'm not asking for grand romantic gestures, she replied. Only honesty and the chance to build something meaningful together. And what of James? Does his memory not complicate matters? It does, she acknowledged. But James is gone, and we are here, living. Would he truly wish us to deny ourselves happiness out of some misplaced sense of loyalty? The question lingered as they rode back to the Abbey in contemplative silence. That evening after dinner, Sebastian excused himself to his study, needing solitude to organize his thoughts. He found himself staring at a portrait of James that hung beside the fireplace, a younger James, painted during their Oxford days, his expression confident and slightly mischievous. What were you thinking? Sebastian murmured to the painted face. Did you foresee this outcome? Did you know your widow and your friend might develop feelings for each other? The portrait offered no answers, but as Sebastian sat in the growing darkness, he began to see the situation with increasing clarity. James had always been perceptive, often understanding Sebastian better than he understood himself. Perhaps this final request had been less about control than insight, recognizing a potential for connection that neither Sebastian nor Jasmine would have pursued without intervention. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Lady Agnes entered, carrying a small leather-bound box. I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this, she said, placing it on the desk before him. It arrived shortly after James's death, with instructions that it should be delivered to you if you and Jasmine agreed to marry. Sebastian stared at the box. You've known about this arrangement all along. James wrote to me about it, she confirmed. He asked for my discretion and my promise to support you both should you choose to honor his request. With trepidation, Sebastian opened the box to find a sealed letter and a smaller velvet case. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably James's, bold, slightly slanted, with flourishes on the capital letters. With unsteady hands, Sebastian broke the seal and began to read. My dear Sebastian, if you are reading this, then two things have occurred. I have left this world earlier than any of us expected, and you have agreed to marry my Jasmine. For both circumstances, I owe you an explanation. My illness was diagnosed 6 months ago, a slow, insidious weakening of the heart that no medicine could cure. I chose to keep this knowledge from everyone, even Jasmine, not wishing to cast a shadow over what time remained. Perhaps this was selfish, but I wanted my final months filled with life rather than anticipatory grief. As for the marriage condition in my will, this requires a more complex explanation. You and I have been friends for 20 years, Sebastian. In that time, I have watched you retreat further into duty and solitude, building walls around your heart that even I could seldom penetrate. You convinced yourself that passion and connection were unnecessary luxuries, that a life of honor and obligation was sufficient. It is not. Jasmine taught me that. Her warmth, her intelligence, her capacity for joy transformed my existence in ways I never imagined possible. Yet I also recognized in her a growing isolation during our marriage. While I pursued my political ambitions and social connections, she was too often left alone, respected as my wife, but rarely seen for herself. You both deserve more than the half-lives you have accepted. You, Sebastian, need someone who will challenge your rigid principles and remind you that duty without love is an empty achievement. Jasmine needs someone who will value her mind as well as her beauty, who will see the remarkable woman behind the role of wife. I believe you could be these people for each other, if given the opportunity. The enclosed ring belonged to my grandmother. Jasmine always admired it, though she never wore it during our marriage. I would be honored if you would offer it to her now, not as a symbol of obligation fulfilled, but as the beginning of something new and entirely your own. Live well, my friend, love deeply, and occasionally remember the man who had the privilege of loving you both, each in your own way. Yours in eternal friendship, James. Sebastian closed the letter, emotions churning through him, grief, confusion, a strange sense of permission, and underneath it all, a growing certainty. He opened the velvet case to find an elegant emerald ring, its deep green stone surrounded by delicate diamonds. Without hesitation, he rose and went in search of Jasmine. He found her in the library, curled in a window seat with a volume of poetry open on her lap. The dying firelight caught the copper highlights in her dark hair and softened her profile. "Sebastian," she said, looking up with a smile that faltered when she saw his expression, "what's happened?" Wordlessly, he handed her the letter. He watched her face as she read, the shock, the tears that gathered but didn't fall, and finally a soft, sad smile of recognition. "So like James," she whispered, "always believing he knew best." Did he, Sebastian asked quietly, know best in this instance? She met his gaze, her eyes luminous with unshed tears. "I think perhaps he did." Sebastian knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "I entered into our engagement out of obligation to James and concern for your welfare. I never expected to discover a woman of such intelligence, strength, and grace. A woman who challenges me to be more than merely dutiful, to be fully alive." He opened the velvet case, revealing the emerald ring. "I'm asking you now not because of any promise or condition, but because I cannot imagine my future without you in it. Will you marry me, Jasmine, not as James's widow or as a duty to be fulfilled, but as yourself, the woman I have come to admire and, yes, to love?" Tears spilled onto her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Sebastian." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Sebastian felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not just the burden of obligation, but the constraints he had placed upon his own heart for so many years. In their place was something new and unexpected: hope. Their wedding, held at Thornfield Abbey's ancient chapel 2 weeks later, was a modest affair attended only by close friends and family. The London gossips expressed disappointment at being excluded from what they had anticipated would be the social event of the season, but Sebastian and Jasmine remained indifferent to society's opinions. As they exchanged vows before the altar where Varingtons had married for centuries, Sebastian found himself thinking of James, not with guilt or reservation, but with profound gratitude. His friend's final gift had been the wisdom to see what Sebastian himself had been blind to: the possibility of a life enriched by love rather than merely defined by duty. Later, as they stood together in the Abbey's rose garden receiving well wishes from their guests, Jasmine leaned close to murmur, "Are you happy, Your Grace?" Sebastian looked down at her, at the woman who had transformed from obligation to beloved in the space of mere months. "Extraordinarily so, Duchess," he replied, "though I suspect James would be insufferably pleased with himself if he could see us now." "Oh, I believe he can," she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief and joy. "And yes, he's absolutely smug about it." Sebastian laughed, a free, unguarded sound that surprised even himself. As he drew his wife closer, he silently acknowledged that his friend had indeed known best. In forcing him to marry his best friend's widow, James had led Sebastian to discover a love he never expected to find, and a happiness he had never believed possible.